eyes the Galactic Republic and begun to strengthen its grip over these worlds. The Empire moved into an expansionist phase. The new regime's desire to push outward its own borders likely had several aspects to it. Whether it was the need for greater resources to power the major construction projects it planned to undertake, the need to find additional workers and taxes to help construct and finance the state, or just Palpatine's desire to rule over and therefore control the world, the outcome was largely the same. Where the Republic had sought to entice new member systems to join its ranks through diplomacy, the Empire would seek to conquer them by force. The Imperial approaches taken to annex its near neighbors would differ slightly from system to system, though it sought to build up its military forces through the creation and deployment of its new Star Destroyers and the recently recruited Stormtroopers. They could not be in all places at once. Furthermore, given the ongoing influence of the Senate, the military had to walk a fine line between fulfilling the Empire's expansionist objectives and appearing to be overly aggressive in a manner that might have difficult political ramifications. Therefore, in order to balance these two competing considerations, the Emperor placed responsibility for the Outer Rim expansions into the hands of someone he could trust, Wilhuff Tarkin. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Tarkin, as will be discussed in more detail in forthcoming chapters, had both the ruthlessness and the strategic instincts that made him invaluable to a man like Palpatine. He was brutal enough to utilize all the available Imperial military resources in targeted campaigns, imaginative enough to find alternative pathways to full military conquest, and connected enough to the Imperial Senate to navigate the political pitfalls. In many ways, we could consider him one of the prime architects of the Empire's successful ascendance. To understand how the Empire grew to its largest size, we must examine the different ways Tarkin and others found to absorb previously unaligned systems. Separatist legacies. Some of the earliest moves made by the Empire to secure new worlds were against systems that were nominally already part of the Galactic Republic, but which existed within very specific legal protections. Across the galaxy, legacy worlds existed that were famed for their natural beauty or the rarity of certain species of plants or animals. Over hundreds of years, the Republic had granted these worlds legislative status and guarantees to ensure that they could not be pillaged for the resources that also existed alongside their natural wonders. Where the Republic had seen such laws as necessary for the longevity of a diverse galaxy, the Empire saw them as an obstacle to progress. However, these legal protections could not just be summarily stripped from legacy worlds without just cause. The Senate would surely protest. Instead, sufficiently good reasons would have to be manufactured. The solution was to be found in the remnants of the defeated Separatist army. It is unclear who crafted the initial plan to circumvent the protections of legacy worlds. Various accounts and records mention both Grand Moff Tarkin and director Orson Krennic, though the pair of them actively cooperating on something seems unlikely given their mutual dislike. Regardless, the plan itself was as inventive as it was cynical. The end of the Clone Wars had left the Empire in possession of huge swathes of weapons and other military materiel seized from the defeated Separatists. Much of it was either of no interest to the new Imperial state or was effectively useless anyway. Battle droids with no command signal to operate them. Heavy weapons that would soon be obsolete as a result of Imperial military advancements. Millions of pistols and blasters that were uncomfortable to use for human hands. While these weapons had little active military value, they could still be used to serve the Empire. In short order, Imperial patrols began to discover caches of Separatist weapons on various legacy worlds like Samovar and Wadi Rafa. These discoveries were quickly reported to the Imperial Senate, and were greeted with outrage. Not only did it appear that these systems had covertly aligned with the separatists during the recent war, but they had used their legacy status to act as a shield behind which they could hide stockpiles of ordnance. These weapons and munitions had not been surrendered at the end of the conflict, and Imperial forces could only assume were intended to be used in future military activities against the Empire. Given such obviously treasonous acts, the Empire and Senate had no choice but to strip these legacy worlds of their legal protections. The case against these legacy worlds was, of course, a lie created by high-ranking Imperial officials. It was they who had hired various smugglers to sneak the weapons into each of their targeted worlds and have them deposited somewhere easily findable for the seemingly random Imperial patrols that would shortly follow. It seems highly implausible that there were not some in the Imperial Senate who recognized this sham for what it was. But set against the specter of a return to the violence and destruction of the Clone Wars, many senators were willing to accept it at face value. Shortly after legacy status was revoked, the Imperial military began occupation proceedings, and each world was quickly designated for full-scale mining operations. So successful was the plan to plant illegal weapons on worlds targeted for Imperial annexation, that it was swiftly expanded beyond just the legacy systems into those that had remained neutral during the Clone Wars and had not been members of the Fallen Republic. If anyone within the Senate bothered to give an overview of the reports to see that weapons with the same distinguishing features and serial numbers were reappearing repeatedly on different planets, they did not raise it as an issue. We can see from the Imperial archives that, had they done so, the pre-planned response would have been to suggest that separatist sympathizers had infiltrated parts of the Imperial military, resulting in a further purge of personnel viewed as having suspect loyalties. It was only when this tactic was attempted in the neutral salient system that it began to encounter resistance. Once again, smugglers had been employed to deposit the weapons, but it appears as though they betrayed the Empire by warning the salient authorities in advance and coordinating with noted rebel fighters like Saw Gerrera. When Tarkin arrived in his Star Destroyer Executrix, he was met with a situation that rapidly devolved into an ongoing and grueling battle where much of the system's infrastructure was destroyed. GA, stripped of the administrative excuse of illegal weapons, Tarkin resorted to a punitive campaign of invasion and occupation to subdue Salient and send a message to other neutral systems who have been tempted to resist Imperial occupation. The Salient affair also brought an end to the policy of expansion by subterfuge. It had largely served its original purpose, and, if it was going to result in fighting anyway, Tarkin and others counseled it was best to approach such. Archives, Section, Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin, Imperial Expansion and Strategy. Systems with overwhelming force to either prompt an immediate surrender or win any subsequent battles swiftly, and send a message out to their neighbors. This approach would eventually crystallize into what would collectively become known as the Tarkin Doctrine of ruling through fear of force, rather than force itself. Before that could be fully implemented, the Empire needed to deal with additional developing problems. Imperial borders. The Galactic Republic had, at various times in its history, incentivized civilians to move from the core worlds to the galactic frontier and outer rim, where they were often equipped with ongoing supplies and assistance. There were various reasons for this. By relocating parts of the population, they freed up space in systems where cities were becoming overcrowded or lacked space for further expansion. Additionally, for the selected worlds that were uninhabited, the Republic was able to begin the process of colonization by those dedicated to seeing the process through. For worlds that already had inhabitants, the new arrivals would serve as strong proponents for the Republic and, it was hoped, eventually lead toward an application for membership. When you also consider that these colonists agreed to supply the Republic of per resources they mined or gathered, then it was a very percentage of any good deal all round. The Empire did not care about such deals, though as was typical of them, where the Republic had seen an opportunity for peaceful enlargement, the new state saw a system to be weaponized. As it completed its annexation of the various legacy worlds around the galaxy, questions. Imperial Archives, Section, Galactic Economic Development Homestead Act, began to arise regarding the future expansion opportunities for the new state. Given imperial requirements for ongoing growth and constant resource extraction, it was only a matter of time before it began to push its borders outward. But there were also issues regarding internal stability that meant some expansion would have to be slowed. Furthermore, the Empire was developing a population problem of its own, by way of seizing new inhabited planets where the resources on the world were highly desirable, but the population was not. Civilians who had been evicted from their homes by imperial officials needed somewhere to go. Not all these undesirables could be sent to the various labor camps that were beginning to appear across the galaxy, lest they be overwhelmed. It appears that it was Grand Moff Tarkin who proposed a solution to this issue. Where once civilians had left the Republic to become residents on remote worlds through choice, the Empire simply deported them. Huge transport ships, organized by the Coalition for Improvements, landed on various planets across the Outer Rim that had not yet been absorbed by the Empire, disgorged their civilian cargo, and left. Senate approval for the measure was secured through a mix of imperial promises to relocate all civilians who had lost their homes through unavoidable but regrettable imperial activities, and the reluctance of many core world senators for their planets to take on additional refugees so soon after the end of the Clone Wars. There were various benefits to this new arrangement. Previously, these emigrants would have brought stories about the benefits of the Republic with them. Now they brought stories and fears that the Empire would surely, at some point in the future, return to conquer these worlds. For now, the Empire managed to rid themselves of civilians they had no use for, who would help instill in their new homes the dangers of resisting imperial rule. 1. Imperial Archives Section, Grand Moff Wulhuf Tarkin, File, Population Relocation, Imperial Archives Section, Masameda, File, Imperial Relocation Speech. Theory, though this did not always prove successful, these refugees would also serve to undercut the existing societies on each new world. The inhabitants soon found they had to compete for resources with these new arrivals who grouped together in so-called Tarkin towns. Conflicts between these groups could help ensure that the population would be sufficiently divided enough to not muster much of a defense when the Empire did return. In this way, the imperial state was able to colonize and slowly conquer some outer rim worlds in installments. As a result of this approach to the worlds right on the borders of the Galactic Empire, some systems ended up inhabiting an ill-defined space between being absorbed and colonized and maintaining some form of independent autonomy. Tatooine, the home planet of Luke Skywalker, is a prime example of this. It was a world that existed outside the Republic while the Republic still stood, and was largely controlled by a representative of the Hutt cartel. In the years leading up to the Battle of Yavin, Tatooine retained aspects of independence from the Empire, something the residents were apparently highly defensive of. But over time, Imperial patrols in the space around the planet and in some of the major cities began to increase. Despite the fact the Empire did not have any specific claim to the planet, there were recruitment offices on the world, and its inhabitants were able to apply to join the Imperial Academy, as Luke Skywalker intended to do. Tatooine and other worlds along the borderline of the Empire's territory remained locked in this dual existence of being partially occupied and colonized without being formally conquered for much of the Empire's existence. This status had benefits for both the Empire and individual systems. While worlds like Tatooine had to deal with living alongside a highly belligerent neighbor, they also avoided some of the worst aspects of life under the Empire, including the war crimes and genocides that, as we will see, became increasingly commonplace in the Outer Rim. For the Empire itself, it was absolved from actually administering borderland worlds, particularly those that were already under the control of Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Noted crime lords, while still being able to draw new recruits from them and, in some places, use Imperial patrols to take a cut of any trade profits. There were other worlds that existed alongside the Empire which were far less fortunate. Expansion by force. While there is an understandable tendency to view the Empire's military endeavors entirely through the sphere of the Galactic Civil War, a topic we shall also be examining in this study. That does, to an extent, distract from the fact that the Empire had effectively been at war for years, even before a structured rebel alliance came into existence. Along the Outer Rim and on worlds in the expansion region, the Empire dispensed with any attempts to covertly conquer or administratively colonize star systems, and instead resorted to overwhelming military force. During this period, the line between imperial expansion and ongoing pacification activities becomes heavily blurred, but both should still be considered as furthering the Empire's overarching goal of securing additional territory for itself. Furthermore, there were additional, more cynical reasons behind the Empire's desire to use force on some worlds, especially those that sat within territory that was nominally controlled by the Republic but had, for whatever reason, remained neutral during the Clone Wars. If Tarkin's emerging doctrine of using fear to maintain Imperial control was going to work, the Empire would have to provide examples of what to be afraid of. Worlds like Ryloth and Mimban provided useful opportunities for this point to be made, the way that the Twi'leks of Ryloth had resisted the Separatist invasions during the Clone Wars had been of great benefit to the Republic. Under the Empire, the same warrior culture and desire to avoid occupation made them an unacceptable liability. Imperial forces attempted to violently disarm the militia of Ryloth in order to guarantee the safety of the new Dunium refinery that was being constructed on the surface. However, resistance to the Emperor's rule remained, under the guise of the Free Ryloth movement operated by General Sham Syndulla. For years, Palpatine's oppressive regime attempted to deal with ongoing guerrilla warfare on Ryloth, fighting against insurgents who operated in the many caves and valleys that crisscrossed the planet's surface. The Empire generally made use of air power, deploying TIE bombers to try and either flush out the insurgents or collapse their underground bases. The bombing runs varied in effectiveness, and it wasn't until Grand Admiral Thrawn took command of the operations on Ryloth that notable successes were achieved. However, that is not to say there were no other benefits to the Empire for having combat drawn out on Ryloth. With the Grand Army of the Republic being disbanded by the new regime, most military personnel were ordinary civilians who either volunteered or were conscripted into service. These forces needed to be blooded in combat to gauge their effectiveness while also providing the Empire opportunity to test out various battle strategies. Ryloth was an excellent contender for the Empire to use as a form of military laboratory, given that the enemy there showed no signs of surrendering, meaning that the fight could continue long enough for Imperial forces to test out new weapons and combat tactics. The fact that the insurgents on Ryloth were committed to violent resistance also made it easier for the Empire to justify its increasing military presence there to the Senate. While there was a danger that the rest of the galaxy would see the Twi'leks continuing to fight and resist the Empire, it was offset by the fact that the Imperial determination to wage war against them would also send a message regarding their own resolve. We can only wonder how many other planets looked at Ryloth and decided they did not wish to become a perpetual ruined battlefield, while Syndulla's homeworld served as an opportunity for the Empire to perfect some of its military strategies. Operations on Mimban brought different benefits. Like Ryloth, Mimban had seen heavy combat during the Clone Wars, with the Mimbanese Liberation Army undertaking battles against the invading separatists. Mimban also had considerable natural resources that had first made it a target for the separatists and then the Empire. The plentiful deposits of hyperbarides, crucial components of turbolaser production, made the planet a highly tempting target, but the Liberation Army were no more willing to allow the Empire to conquer them than they had been the Separatists. Once again, the Empire deployed extensive military forces to the campaign. Star Destroyers, TIE Fighters, and various ground forces were all committed to the operation. The planet's climate made it a very difficult environment to wage war in. The heavily ionized atmosphere meant that conditions were almost perpetually misty, and the surface quickly became almost impassably muddy. For Imperial soldiers, generally referred to as mud troopers, the conditions were hellishly difficult. The indigenous combatants were well acquainted with their own battlegrounds and would attack out of the mists using camouflage and secret tunnels, making every battle a grueling and attritional slog. As it turns out, that was exactly what the Empire was hoping for. As with Ryloth, the Mimbanese campaign allowed for Imperial forces to be trained directly in combat, which helped prepare the military for the battles yet to come. But more important were the legislative and funding opportunities the campaign presented. While the Empire planned a substantial military expansion, the construction of new capital ships and fighter squadrons, and the recruiting of new legions of stormtrooper yars was expensive. Though the Empire might control the taxation of the galaxy, the spending of that money had, to varying degrees, to go through Senate oversight. Trying to gain approval for additional military expenditure was difficult when the Empire was nominally at peace. However, being able to point to the campaign on Mimban and suggest it was dragging on simply because the Empire lacked the resources to decisively win the battle was a far more compelling argument. As a result, it seems highly plausible that General Ire Falk, the commanding officer on Mimban, was under instructions to ensure that the battle was drawn out for as long as necessary.